A sheep in the Scottish Highlands, dubbed Britain's loneliest sheep, may have to spend the winter alone.
What happens when you take a complex, multicellular animal, something that depends on food, water, and a stable environment, and leave it on an island that doesn't have any of those things yet? No one should survive there. And for a long time, researchers thought the same. Because in 1973, 5 fishermen took 13 sheep and dropped them on an island where the lava had barely finished cooling. The researchers didn't expect them to survive, but what they did changed everything we thought we knew about how evolution works. This is the story of how a single reckless decision turned one of the most carefully controlled natural experiments into a disruption no one was prepared for. The beginning. It all began on November 14, 1963. That day, in the cold waters of the North Atlantic, about 32 kilometers off the southern coast of Iceland, something unusual broke the surface. A fishing vessel sailing near the Vestmannaeyjar archipelago noticed a dark column rising from the sea. At first, it looked like smoke from a distant fire, but as they moved closer, it became clear. This wasn't a ship. The ocean itself was erupting. Within just a few days, something extraordinary began to appear. A dark mass rose above the waves. By the end of the first week, this newborn island had already stretched over 500 meters in length and reached a height of about 45 meters. But it was fragile, made mostly of loose volcanic rock that still. And as this new land continued to rise from the sea, it was officially named Surtsey after Surtur, the fire giant from Norse mythology. The eruption kept going for 3.5 years. By the time it finally ended on June 5, 1967, the island had reached about 2.7 square kilometers and stood as high as 174 meters above sea level. What began as an invisible disturbance deep beneath the ocean had become something permanent. This wasn't just land, it was a blank world. And scientists immediately saw an opportunity in it. A once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. A place where you could actually watch, from the very beginning, how life colonizes somewhere it had never existed before. Icelandic authorities moved quickly. The island was locked down and declared one of the most restricted nature reserves in the world. Only a handful of researchers were allowed to visit, and even they had to follow extreme rules. Every step was monitored to make sure not a single seed, insect, or organism was accidentally introduced. And for the first few years, everything went exactly as planned. A single fly arrived, then a few drifting seeds. Then the first plant, a sea rocket, pushed its way through the volcanic gravel. Slowly, life began to take hold. And then, all of a sudden, something unusual happened. The sheep introduction. Nobody knows exactly what was going through their heads. In 1973, about 10 years after Surtsey first rose out of the ocean, 5 Icelandic fishermen decided to try something. Not as part of a study, not with permission, just to see what would happen. They took 13 sheep, loaded them onto a small boat, and sailed out to the island. When they arrived, they unloaded them directly onto the bare volcanic ground, an environment that, by every scientific expectation, could not support them. And then they left, just like that. No monitoring, no plan to return, no concern for the years of controlled research already underway. Because by that point, Surtsey wasn't just an island. It was one of the most carefully protected natural laboratories in the world. Scientists had spent nearly a decade ensuring that every stage of life arriving there happened naturally, without interference, without contamination. And now, suddenly, there were 13 grazing animals walking across it, eating the few plants that had managed to grow, trampling fragile moss, moving nutrients in ways that were never supposed to happen. The reaction from the scientific community was immediate and furious. Years of strict protocols, boots sterilized, equipment cleaned, access tightly controlled, and in a single afternoon, all of that had been bypassed. Still, despite the outrage, most scientists weren't worried about long-term damage, because, as far as anyone could tell, those sheep weren't going to last for long on this volcanic island. The unexpected survival. But before we get to what happened to the sheep, we need to understand what these animals actually were. Icelandic sheep are not typical sheep. They've descended from animals brought by Viking settlers, and most importantly, they have been isolated for over 1,000 years. So, over time, they adapted to survive in one of the harshest environments on Earth: cold climates, poor grazing land, and long, unforgiving winters. They're smaller than most modern breeds, but they're tougher, more resilient, built to survive on very little. If any sheep had a chance of lasting on a place like survve, it was these. And on survve, they started doing exactly what they were built to do. They ate everything. Instead of relying on abundant grass, they picked at whatever they could find: moss, sparse vegetation, even bits of organic material washed ashore. Moss that had taken years to establish, gone. Young plants, gone. They moved across the island in a way that one researcher later described as almost methodical destruction. Water, which should have been a major problem, didn't stop them either. They found ways to survive on minimal sources, licking moisture from rocks, collecting dew, and taking advantage of rain when it came. It wasn't reliable, but it was enough. And when the weather turned, they adapted again. The island had no trees, no caves, or shelter, but it did have cracks, volcanic crevices, uneven terrain, and small depressions formed during the eruption. The sheep used these as shelter, tucking themselves into the landscape to escape the worst of the wind. Although some of the sheep didn't survive the winter, they had learned to adapt, and that was enough to change everything. The ecosystem changes. Here's where the story stops being about survival and starts being about something bigger. The sheep weren't just surviving on survve. They were changing it. It started with what they ate. The island's early vegetation, mosses, and a handful of fragile plants that had taken years to establish, was being cleared out. Areas that scientists had been carefully observing were suddenly stripped bare. The slow, predictable progression of plant life was being interrupted. But that wasn't the real impact. The real change came from what they left behind. Sheep produce manure, constantly, and in an environment like survve, that mattered more than anything. Because at that point, the island had almost no real soil, just volcanic rock and loose ash, with barely any organic material. Nothing to hold nutrients, nothing to support sustained plant growth. But sheep droppings are rich in nitrogen, and wherever the sheep grazed, they left it behind. Slowly, those areas began to change. The ground became darker, richer, more capable of holding moisture and nutrients, and plants started responding. They didn't just grow, they grew faster, thicker, stronger than anything seen before on the island. And then something else added to it: seabirds. By the mid-1970s, survve had become a nesting ground for gulls and other birds. They brought fish back from the ocean. Some of it was dropped, some of it decomposed, and their droppings, guano, added even more nutrients to the soil. Now, certain parts of the island weren't just receiving one source of nutrients, they were getting both: sheep manure, bird guano, decaying organic matter, a concentrated nutrient system that, under natural conditions, would have taken decades, maybe centuries, to develop. And the effect was immediate. In areas where sheep grazed heavily, vegetation didn't disappear. It came back faster. The sheep had triggered a chain reaction, and step by step, the entire ecosystem began to reorganize itself around their presence. And what started as a simple act of curiosity by fishermen was about to leave a permanent mark on the island, a lasting impact. As news of the sheep's survival began to spread, scientists began returning to Surtsey more frequently. This time, they were documenting something they had never planned to study. Not just how life naturally colonizes a new island, but what happens when that process is disrupted. They started tracking the sheep. At the same time, they collected soil samples from different parts of the island. And within just a few years, the results were clear. The soil wasn't the same. In places where sheep had been active, the ground contained significantly more organic material, more structure. It held moisture better. It supported faster plant growth. In untouched areas, the island was still following the original path of slow evolution. But in grazed areas, everything was accelerated. And that shift didn't stop at plants. As the vegetation changed, so did everything else. More insects began to appear. Then came spiders, feeding on those insects. Bird activity increased as new food sources became available. A food web was forming. But then something started to shift. The island wasn't improving forever, because while nutrients were being added in some places, the total amount of available food was still limited. Surtsey was small, just a few square kilometers, and most of it was still bare volcanic ground. So, over time, food sources declined, and by the early 1980s, the sheep began dying one by one, until eventually, none were left. But what they left behind didn't disappear, because even decades later, scientists could still see it. They had permanently changed the island's trajectory. And that's where the real debate began. Some scientists argued that the sheep should have been removed immediately. Others disagreed, because what happened instead was something no one could have designed. The sheep hadn't just survived. They had reshaped the entire system. They weren't just animals passing through an environment. They were what ecologists call ecosystem engineers. And their impact still continues to shape the island today, even after they are gone. So, what do you think about all of this? Should scientists have intervened early and removed the sheep from Surtsey? Or did they make the right choice by staying away from it? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more amazing science stories like this one.